Oh, hello. My name is Mara and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Guys, we are like pretty much at the end of ye old Project Poirot. I wanted to do a wrap-up video this week for the project, and then next week I'm going to do my where to start with Poirot recommendations, and then yeah, that will be it for Project Poirot. It's been a ride, man. Like, I'm really glad I did this. This is something I've always kind of wanted to do, and being on BookTube gave me an opportunity, and just looking back, I went through and watched a lot of my videos, and I was like, oh god, like, definitely I feel like grown in my ability to discuss these books well, and I don't know. Some of the things I look back, I'm like, I don't know if I still agree with myself on that, but you know, it was kind of fun to do that, and I did it so that I could do a little wrap-up video for you guys today with the top 10 things that I've taken away from this project. So enough of my yammering. Let's get into the list. Okay, so the first thing that I definitely am taking away is that Agatha Christie has a real sort of like visceral revulsion to people who are controlling or people who are petty or tyrannical in the context of like the domestic sphere and interpersonal relationships. I think the way she describes some of the characters who fall into this type of category, most notably the mother in Appointment with Death, I think you can tell she has just like a true kind of like gut level revulsion to that kind of controlling attitude and personality, and I think she really does view that as true evil. So that was something that it was kind of, I'd seen in her books before, but reading them chronologically, it made it really clear that she just has, like I said, sort of just like a gut level, just like, ugh, to people who are overly controlling of the people around them. Again, I think because, I think I talked about this in my mid-year wrap-up, or my mid-year check-in, but I basically think that some of that has to do with the fact that she is a woman, and that a lot of her crimes are kind of happening in the domestic sphere, and I think women are kind of trained, at least in this time period, we're more trained to observe these types of things because literally their entire kind of job or role was to be good wives, good mothers, and good hostesses, at least women of a certain class, right? So this is also why someone like Jane Austen is so great at sort of observing kind of the intricacies of domestic relations. Women of a certain class, that was their job, and so they are particularly well suited to kind of record that for us. So yeah, anyway, I definitely think that's a recurring theme in the Poirot books. Number 2 is what I'm going to call the Tatiana / see me with them hands theme of Agatha Christie, which is what you see isn't always the truth. And what I mean by that is that I think that that's a bigger theme in most mysteries, this idea that appearance does not necessarily concord with reality, that you can never fully just trust your perception of an event or a person to be able to kind of come to the root of whatever the mystery is. And I think that that's, like I said, I think that's kind of what mysteries are meant to teach us, if they have any kind of moral lesson, is that appearance does not equal reality. This is a theme that Agatha Christie really likes to play with. You know, a lot of her books include impersonations or actors in particular. Anytime you see an actor in a Christie, you should sort of be like, okay, why are they here? So she sort of has a lot of sort of playing with this idea of maybe you think these two people are in love, but it turns out, no, they're not. They're actually, these other two people are in love in this couple. She does that trick a lot. She does a lot of kind of like fake deaths, or, oh, you thought that I was here, but actually I was impersonating somebody and I was there. She really likes kind of playing with those kind of plot or trope aspects, and I think she ties it into kind of some of her thematic content. So I think what you see isn't always the truth is definitely a big takeaway from Christie, and always be suspicious of actors. Also, always be suspicious of German doctors and journalists. She doesn't like them either. Number 3 is that blood always tells in Christie. I think it's just thematically this is something that she builds on more and more and more as time goes on. But actually the first time I noticed this was in Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which is the 3rd novel. So it's something she was interested in from the beginning. I think she's very intrigued by the kind of nurture versus nature debate, and comes out firmly on the side of nature. I think she is sort of essentially, it's a way for her to channel some of her class snobbery, because I think often it's in the context of good breeding. I do think she also verges into some eugenics territory sometimes with the way she talks about this particular topic, but this is probably, if I had to pick one theme aside from what you see isn't always the truth, just because I think that broader, like on a big scale, that is what mystery itself is thematically about. But for Christie in particular, I think she is very thematically interested in this idea of blood tells, and in terms of just figuring out her plots, you should try to figure out what kind of person somebody's relatives are. If you can figure that out, you'll have a pretty good idea of who Christie thinks they are. Number 4 is that xenophobia and exoticism of other races / countries is a thing in the Poirot books. I think it comes up so much, I think in part because she chose a foreign detective. So Poirot, by his very presence, introduces this kind of otherness to the conversation of whatever scene he's on. And so Christie has a lot of commentary on particularly British xenophobia of foreigners. Over time, she transfers that kind of xenophobic aspect mostly to servants and to military people, but it's something that's definitely still there in a lot of her books. I also think she does kind of exoticize a lot of the kind of foreign locales she sets some of the Poirot books in, notably something like Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile, Murder in Mesopotamia. I mean, that whole little kind of subcategory of Poirot books that are set abroad, I definitely think you see some kind of questionable portrayals of local peoples, essentially non-white people. And I do think that over time, I think Christie has probably relative to her peers a more progressive attitude towards foreigners or non-white people. So I do think she deserves credit in a lot of her books for trying to bring up that discussion in what we would describe as a positive way. That being said, I don't know that she's always entirely successful with that. See in particular Hickory Dickory Dock. I don't love how that was all handled. And you know, I think it's an interesting, I do think it's interesting because especially as a contemporary reader, reading back into this period, I think it gives us an opportunity to reflect on that period of history, and to reflect on, you know, like I said, I think Poirot just being non-British brings up a lot of these conversations, but you also get a lot of insight into sort of like the British suspicion of French people, the British suspicion of Germanic people, and then just general kind of like race stuff. You definitely get some insight into that through Christie. Number 5 is that I think the parent-child relationship in Christie evolves over time, and particularly the daughter-mother relationship evolves in its portrayal over time. So in earlier Christie, I think parenting, parents, children, all of that is portrayed in sort of a almost negative light, I think, or at least a neutral light. There's a lot of sort of like absentee parents in early Christie, or kind of disinterested parents. Just in general, I think that there's a kind of parents are portrayed either neutrally in that they're not around, or there's a lot of parents who are portrayed pretty negatively. See in particular Appointment with Death, or something like Hercule Poirot's Christmas, right? But as time goes on, the one relationship that I think grows in terms of Christie's esteem for it and feeling that it is important is the mother-daughter relationship. I think by the end of her Poirot book, she really has the sense that mothers need to be a strong presence in their daughters' lives to keep their daughters kind of like on the right path in the modern world. And I think that this is sort of tied into her kind of more negative views of how like womanhood and femininity evolve in the 60s and into the 70s. I think she just was really, it seems that she was very uncomfortable with all of the freedoms that the sexual revolution gave to young women in particular. And over time, you can definitely see that she feels more strongly that that is an important relationship. Whereas in earlier books, it seems like she's ambivalent to negative about that relationship. So I thought that was interesting as I read through these Poirot books. Number 6 is that she seems to have a complicated and evolving relationship with adultery. She, especially in some of these earlier books, has a pretty laissez-faire attitude towards adultery in a lot of ways. She seems to be pretty kind of just expecting that it's a thing that's going to happen, which is perhaps not that surprising in her time period for men, you know, especially in the Victorian age. Essentially the entire way households were set up were almost presupposing that men were going to be using, at a minimum, the service of prostitutes outside of their marriage, and potentially even a mistress of some sort. But Christie seems to also just have a complicated relationship with the idea of women being adulteresses. Sometimes it's portrayed positively, sometimes it's portrayed negatively, but I do think that it's interesting that she doesn't have an outright condemnation of it. I think as time goes on, there's more of a negative association with adultery. Like the older she gets, it seems that she's less and less okay with it. I do wonder if that is somewhat reflective of some of her personal experiences, because she was cheated on by both of her husbands. So anyway, I don't want to get too autobiographical in my reading here. It also could just be that she was getting older and more conservative, who knows. But I do think that there's a little bit of a shift in how she talks about people cheating as time goes on. And I think over time it becomes closer to the kind of old saying of cheaters never prosper. Though I don't know that that meant, you know, cheating on your spouse, but you know, you get what I'm saying. So anyway, I think that it was interesting to me when I was kind of making notes to realize, like, yeah, I think that her attitude in these books, and Poirot's attitude also, I think kind of shifts a little bit over time. Number 7 is I think that these books have a real tension in them between naturalism and romanticism. And what I mean by that is that over and over again, we are told by Poirot that he does his deductions using his little gray cells, that you have to use your mind to figure things out. And there's a real kind of, at least explicitly in the text, there is a praise and kind of idolization of rationalism, materialism, our ability to work things through. But I think that that's kind of in tension in an interesting way within the Poirot character himself, because he is quite sentimental. He is quite almost Victorian in a lot of his kind of ideas about morality and his ideas about love in particular. And, you know, I wonder if also just because he's Belgian, so he's a Francophone, from a Francophone country, he's sort of got, he's from a more romantic culture. I wonder if there's almost just kind of at a base level a tension there, because he does often have a real soft spot for young lovers in particular, and he, you know, often is Papa Poirot and kind of plays matchmaker between people, and he also has moments where he's open to the idea of supernatural explanations. Sometimes he's very dismissive of it, but other times he's more like, well, you know, I mean, I don't necessarily think that's what it is, but I can't prove to you that it's not that. And I don't know if it could just be inconsistency in the writing. That's completely possible, but I also wonder if there's just some kind of, in the Poirot character himself, a little bit of kind of dramatization of the tension between natural and material kind of focus and philosophy, and more kind of like ethereal, romantic, or supernatural kind of philosophical bent, because I think he has moments of representing both. Oh, and I guess I should say on the naturalism versus romanticism angle, the place that we see this best personified is Poirot as representing sort of naturalism and Hastings representing romanticism. I think that Christie kind of plays off of that pretty intentionally in these books, which is part of what makes me wonder if she's aware of some of the tensions within the Poirot character himself. Number 8 is that we do, you know, Poirot tells us he has a very bourgeois attitude towards murder, but I think in general we can see in him a bourgeois attitude towards a lot of things. I say that. Actually, when I'm thinking of this, it's not just Poirot. Two of these are actually more Hastings, and I think Poirot is a little bit more ambiguous, but I think both Hastings and Poirot have a pretty bourgeois attitude towards drugs, and drugs, I never really thought about it before, but are a huge theme in the Poirot books. Like, so many of the plots revolve around drug use or drug smuggling, or somebody being made to think that they're crazy because of drugs, or there's a lot of interesting use of drugs in the Christie-verse, especially in these Poirot books. And Poirot and Hastings both seem to have a pretty bourgeois attitude towards drugs, which is like, they aren't a good idea. I'm not saying that that's good or bad, just that I do think that that's very present. And then the two things that I think Hastings has a very bourgeois attitude towards are kind of maintaining appearances. So in Hastings, we get a lot of sort of like hand-wringing about like, oh, you shouldn't, you know, read letters, or look through peepholes, or oh, you need to keep a stiff upper lip. There's a lot of like kind of conventional British mores that Hastings is very dedicated to upholding, and and I think to great amusement, and I think Poirot often is challenging some of his attitudes on that. And then the other thing is divorce, right? So I think that Hastings kind of has this sense, kind of more old-timey sense of divorce being something like really shameful. I think over time, just generally as a comment in these Poirot books, it's interesting to see how British society in general is changing its attitudes towards divorce, and I definitely think you see that reflected in these books. But But anyway, there's a couple of things that I think we see some sort of bourgeois hand-wringing about in these Poirot books, in a way that I think is sometimes played as contrast and sometimes just sort of implicitly assumed on the author's part that the reader will share those opinions. Number 9 is psychology versus forensics, and I've talked about this a lot, so I won't go into it too much, but I think that this reread really made me kind of synthesize the fact that I think that Christie does her best work when she's working on the level of psychological clues as opposed to forensic clues. And I would never have really thought about this before in terms of mystery tropes, but there are definitely some mystery writers who are very focused on, like, there was a footprint here, and then there's this timeline we're trying to put together, and then this and that and the other. And Christie does do that from time to time, but I think her best work is happening when really we're getting our clues on a character level. I think that pretty much nobody does that better than her, and I think that Poirot works better that way too. And actually Marple too. I mean, I say that. I think both of her two main characters work best when they're kind of thinking through the like what kinds of people are, and that leads them to kind of put together the forensic aspects, as opposed to the other way around. So yeah, I just think that she does her best work in the realm of sort of psychological clues, and yeah, Poirot, I think that is his real strength as opposed to, you know, measuring footprints and stuff. And then finally, I put down number 10 is just like, world history is awesome. And I guess what I mean by that is I started reading this because I thought, oh, you know, if you did a chronological reread, you really would just get like the scope of kind of like early 20th century evolution of social morality, but also just like world events, whatever. And I think that this reread has really proved that that was a valid hypothesis. I have loved like kind of seeing a social perspective on all of these different events in world history. World War I, World War II, the Depression, the Cold War, the rise of new technologies, the ascendancy of the US. So we have a lot, especially in the 30s, all this discussion of sort of like the death of the British aristocracy and the rise of sort of this American meritocracy. A lot of really interesting discussion about changing social structures and how various kind of like social movements are impacting the way people think about things. These are just fascinating books to read as like insight and windows into history. And if you're a history nerd like me, and you've never read a Poirot book, I definitely think that this would be a fun read with that lens, because it definitely rewards that kind of a read. And I just enjoyed the hell out of doing this entire project. I learned a lot about Christie. I think I learned a lot about her as a writer, what I do and don't like in her work and mysteries in general. And I also just learned, I think, new things about history and kind of made some new connections between different trends that were happening at the same time and how they may have impacted each other. So this was a really fruitful reread for me, especially just with that historical lens. So yeah, those are sort of my thoughts wrapping up Poirot. I will have my Where to Start with Poirot video next week, and I'm sure there will be some hot debate about how good my recommendations on that score are. I do want to announce tentatively the dates for Mission Marple. So I've mentioned before that I was kind of on the fence about doing this, but I ultimately thought, you know what, I really enjoyed Project Poirot. I don't like Marple as much as I like Poirot, but I've also not read her in a long time, and I know a lot of the people who watch these videos love Marple, so I thought that this would be a fun kind of communal project to do together. And I have gone ahead and picked some dates, so I'm going to do it next year, at the beginning of next year. And what I've decided to do is that we'll read a book every other week, and I'll put the schedule, the tentative schedule at least, in the description of this video so that you guys can see what I'm thinking. But basically it's going to go from mid-January to mid-August, and I want to give people plenty of time in terms of like when we're reading various books and an extra week in between books, so that hopefully more people will be able to read along. But it will start on January 18th with Murder at the Vicarage, January 18th, 2019, and we will go from there every other week reading a Marple book. So I'm looking forward to that. I think that that will be a lot of fun. I have a question for you guys. Is there any interest in doing something with that in Goodreads, like having some sort of like a book club or forum discussion or whatever? I don't know if that's something that people would be interested in. I guess I'll put a poll somewhere up here. If there's not that much interest in it, that's totally fine, but I just thought this might be a way to kind of at least give some people who like reading Agatha Christie a way to find each other and do a kind of structured reread together as a group. So if you're interested in doing that, definitely let me know. We'll see. No pressure either way. It's just an idea, and I will probably ask about this again once we get closer to time. So I will definitely do a video announcing the schedule again, probably in December to remind people, but mark your calendars because in January, Mission Marple is coming to you. As a side note, I think I'm also probably in October going to start doing Whimsy Wednesdays, where I read through the Dorothy Sayers Lord Whimsy series, but like one a month. I'm not committing to doing that all the time, but like keep your eyes open because I will eventually have a playlist going for Whimsy Wednesdays, because I love those books too. So keep your eyes open for that. So I think that will do it. We got one video left, but Project Poirot is basically over. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having a really great day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!